The Northern Hemisphere is witnessing unprecedented heat, floods and fires. The effects of climate change are now happening quicker than scientists had predicted. So what are the dangers of these erratic weather patterns and how do we keep safe? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Now, from record-breaking heat waves to overwhelming floods, extreme weather conditions are causing death and destruction around the world. In the Northern Hemisphere, summer has been marked by scorching heat and health warnings from southern Europe to Asia. While these conditions are not necessarily new, they are becoming more frequent, more intense, and in many cases, more disastrous. The United Nations says that global warming is fueling this, affecting everything from our ecosystems to mass migration. So what should governments do and how might we reverse some of the damage? We'll put those questions to our guests shortly, but first, this report from Katia Lopez-Horoyan.
Water is a luxury in this Senegalese village. For years, a dangerous combination of high temperatures and little rain have meant dry lands and desperate communities.
We can't use our one well for gardening because then we won't have enough water to drink. We would then need a second well for crops to feed ourselves and perhaps even sell vegetables.
Similar situations are becoming more common across continents. As global warming intensifies, the UN says droughts have become nearly 30% more frequent since the year 2000. The report shows they will likely get worse in the future and last longer. Extreme weather is having disastrous consequences. Hotter and drier summers in Greece have made it more difficult to tame wildfires like this one north of Athens. In Italy's capital and across southern Europe, record-breaking heat waves are reaching dangerous levels for people like Remo. He's 90 years old and lives alone.
I'm not too worried about myself. I'm more worried about homeless people out on the street.
The heat is also unbearable in parts of northern Mexico. Asylum seekers in the border city of Nuevo Laredo face tough conditions with little protection from the scorching 43-degree heat.
We need to drink cold beverages constantly to adjust our body temperature, but most of the day we feel low in energy and dehydrated. My daughter's lips are severely chapped, even though I give her vitamin water and creams.
In countries like India, the challenge is different. A period of heavy rain has caused the banks of the Yamuna River to burst. Now flooding around the Taj Mahal in Agra City and nearby neighborhoods is worrying locals and visitors alike.
We're afraid our houses may get damaged. We can't sleep at night because we're worried the water level will keep rising.
Environmental activists agree the need to address extreme weather conditions is urgent. But more pressing, they say, is for governments to implement measures that can prevent them from happening. Katia Lopez-Horoyan for Inside Story.
Well, let's now bring in our guests. In Paris, we have Catherine Gamper. She leads the work on climate change adaptation at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. In Geneva, we have John Nairn. He's a senior extreme heat advisor at the World Meteorological Organization. And in Kent, in the United Kingdom, Dorothy Guerrero, head of policy and advocacy at Global Justice Now, a non-governmental organization which campaigns on issues of development in the Global South. A very, very warm welcome to you all. Thanks for joining us today on Inside Story. John, let me start with you. We knew this was coming, but did it perhaps happen a little bit quicker than we expected?
Well, to be honest, the heat that we're seeing and the weather patterns that are supporting it are quite consistent with the advice that we've seen from the IPCC. The problem that we're facing, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, is the damage to the North Pole. The lack of ice is resulting in anomalous warming, and that's weakening the jet stream and resulting in patterns that lock in weather patterns during the summer in particular. And persistent patterns with clear open skies, anticyclones that are delivering these heat waves are one arm of the problem that we're seeing. The other arm are the persistent troughs, which are sitting next to these heat waves, where we're seeing these persistent storms and very heavy rainfall. And so these two sit side by side. We're seeing in this very energetic time of year, the persistent extreme heat and the persistent heavy rainfall events.
John, you were just saying there that this is not far off from IPCC predictions, the IPCC being the expert panel on climate change that's been looking into this for many years. Catherine, if we knew this was coming, were we prepared?
That is a very good question. Indeed, as John is saying, what we're seeing today is very consistent with what the IPCC is telling us. And in fact, the IPCC is telling us if we are looking at a 4.5 degree warming going forward, 80% of the world population might be subject to extreme heat. So what we're seeing now may not be what we need to expect in the future. The future might actually become quite worse. And even though we expected this warming to happen, cities around the Northern Hemisphere are ill-prepared for it. So only now, after consecutive years of exposure to extreme heat waves, cities like Paris, London, New York, Los Angeles are getting into the gear of actually preparing for reducing warming. But it will take time. Some of the measures that we can take, for example, vegetizing cities, changing the design of cities, are not measures that can help us decrease temperatures from today to tomorrow. And in the meantime, we need to protect vulnerable people. But there are measures. For example, in Melbourne, there is their extreme heat plan foresees to replant the cities full of forests by 2050 to decrease the urban heat island effect by 4 degrees by 2050. But again, as you can see, it may take time to actually take action. In the US, the White House extreme heat plan is actually pouring billions into remaking houses. Poor housing will be upgraded to actually install roofs that can help us bring temperatures down in cities. And we're upgrading energy and transport infrastructure so that we're confronted with less failure to increase their resilience going forward under extreme heat conditions. But all of this takes time, and we're getting late into action.
Well, it takes time and takes money. I want to get into some of the adaptation strategies in just a moment, but let me just bring Dorothy into the discussion here, because you, Dorothy, have been part of a movement that's been campaigning around these issues for decades, really. How are you feeling now as you watch climate predictions unfold in reality, knowing the choices that governments and corporations and individuals have made to get us to this point?
Yeah, thank you, Nastasya, for having me in this program. Yes, indeed, governments, corporations, and us non-government and not-for-profit organizations are all aware that climate change is happening and that all impacts are happening faster than earlier predicted. The Intergovernment Panel on Climate Change is now on its 6th report last year. All the multilateral meetings of governments, multilateral development banks and trade blocs, big summits like the World Economic Forum have put climate change in the top 3 concerns in all the meetings. But despite that, governments fail to do climate actions that are commensurate to the challenge. They are still following the same development model, growth-oriented model that have actually created this crisis. And then on the other hand, corporations, especially those that are extracting fossil fuels, so gas, oil, coal, have spent decades denying that climate change is happening. And in fact, they even have their in-house climate experts. But despite knowing that, and despite an almost accurate forecast and studies on climate change, they have denied it. And now that they have lost in the debate, the actions, the programs that they're putting on the table are not appropriate for the challenge we are facing. It's more business than usual so that they can continue profiting. We have seen the profits of big fossil fuel corporations reaching historic levels last year, reach historic level at the first quarter of the year. So Shell even said that they are going back on their commitments made to their shareholders 2 years ago. So that means they are not ready to put appropriate actions. They wanted to continue profiting. For
Dorothy,
many people...
Sorry, you were just mentioning something there around climate denialism.
Many are not aware.
I just want to clarify something for our viewers as well, and I want to direct this to John, because I believe we've already hit temperature rise above baseline levels from the 1900s of around 1.16 degrees Celsius. And we also know that this is the beginning of a number of years of El Nino too, which is contributing, and we know that that could push us over that 1.5 degree, very critical threshold. How much of what we're seeing right now, John, is due to climate change, and how much due to El Nino?
That's a very good question. We look at the average global temperature to help us guide policymakers, and we have seen the global temperature oscillate due to La Nina and El Nino influences. But what we've also seen is that baseline shifting. So now, normally an El Nino results in a warmer globe, La Nina a cooler period. But what we've seen in the last 3 years of La Nina are global average temperatures that are higher than the El Nino global average temperatures of the 80s. So the El Nino, the ENSO cycle, El Nino, La Nina cycle is still there, but the background global increase in temperatures is dominating, and it is continuing to shift our climates to continually upset them. I can only stress that the Northern Hemisphere period of the summer period is being dominated by the loss of sea ice across the North Pole. So ENSO is a feature within that, which will amplify the signal. But there are more than one signal that we should pay attention to, more than one part of the globe that is exhibiting stress. At the moment, the ocean temperature anomalies are a sea of red in terms of it's very hard to see any part of the global oceans, 70% of the surface of the globe, where we are seeing anything other than warm anomalies.
And as everyone keeps saying, we're clearly in uncharted territory here. Now, Dorothy, you mentioned there a lot of the propaganda that's been shared around the idea of global warming. A lot of people obviously have a lot of vested interests here. Catherine, I want to ask you, do you think that this extreme weather now is convincing people that climate change, people who perhaps didn't think that climate change was a real threat, is changing their minds? And do people genuinely think that the extreme weather that we're seeing is due to climate change and therefore actually adapting their behaviour to adjust to that?
Well, that's at least what we hope. At least I think in the Northern Hemisphere, what the extreme events you're seeing today are undeniably causing an enormous amount of damage, an enormous amount of cascading effects throughout our economies and in societies. And they need adapting to. This is a political mandate. This is a political question that is undeniable. Whether or not those in charge believe it is an anthropogenic climate change or not, I guess, is yet another debate. But what we see is, at least in previous years, there was much debate that climate change adaptation is really a task that is left to the global south, to small island states that are being inundated by sea level rise and so forth. But the extreme events we're seeing in the Northern Hemisphere does now beg the question and does speed up government action, also in European countries, in Northern American countries, and really across the OECD spectrum, really to gear up and accelerate their adaptation measures. I'm taking a couple of examples. In Germany, the floods that were caused in the Ahr Valley that caused a loss to the federal government and a federal government layout of 30 billion euros really does cause a change of mind of who is responsible for actually trying to prevent these damages. The wildfires that we've seen recently, such as the Camp fires in 2018, as well as the bushfires, both of them caused $20 billion in damage. We are really unprecedented events, and if you were to put that money into preventing these events in the future, that would obviously save you a lot of money. And we do see that things are accelerating. climate change adaptation plans, comprehensive ones, are in place across all of the OECD today. They are trying to accelerate and mainstream their actual implementation by setting concrete targets. So now we're not just saying we need to increase our resilience, we're saying this is the number of people we need to save by 2050 from sea level rise.
Catherine, you're talking there about adaptation plans, right, in terms of dealing with the impacts of climate change. Dorothy, given that now that we're seeing so much impact on the global north, are you sensing a greater sense of urgency in terms of dealing with climate challenges? And I'm not just talking about adaptation here, but mitigation, so trying to reduce emissions or other sectors of climate action.
Yes, first I say that we now we have lost a decade or two in action and adaptation. And now that people are seeing and experiencing directly the impacts of climate change, which has been experienced by people in the global south or the global majority far longer than what we're experiencing here in the north, there is a change of attitude. But then at the same time, we need to increase that understanding that when we see floods on TV, we also have to think of our climate footprints. And then also for policymakers and governments, they need to prepare for events beyond current records, particularly with trends caused by anthropogenic climate change, enhancing the probability of extremes. So now planning should be made on the extremes. And when you also mentioned about how the global north and south can cooperate on this, there must be solidarity. There must be also, that's why we are doing the campaigning here in the UK for our government to put more climate finance on the table, to do more than usual, and not to backtrack on commitments. I think that is very, very important, because even if on the household level, we understand that we need to segregate our waste, or we need to cut on electricity use or decrease electricity use, that will not be enough, because what is important is for the huge and historic emitters to cut emissions, for corporations to stop profiting on the shoulders of people from the south, and also with impacts on climate. So I think those are the important understanding that we need to come into.
Dorothy, you were just talking there about planning for extremes, right? And Catherine, you mentioned there that time could be running out. John, I want to ask you a question around global climate dynamics that we're seeing. We obviously know they're hugely interdependent. You were talking about the sea ice and ocean warming, for instance. We know that one climate impact will have an impact on another, creating a sort of vicious cycle, so to speak. When we've talked about tipping points in the past, so a point at which we get into a space that is irreversible, people have often dismissed that as being overdramatic. How close are we to a tipping point now, John?
Look, what I'm happy to talk about are cascading and compounding events. I'm not as confident about understanding and being able to tell that story about tipping points. If you want to go to a Venus planet, that's quite different story, because that's helping people give up. I think what we need to concentrate on are the probable futures that we can envisage within a decade or two. And what I can tell you at this point in time is that we are seeing the boreal forests of the Northern Hemisphere burn at a rate that is unprecedented, and that will cascade into more heat and more damaging smoke events that will lead to bad health outcomes. We should tell these stories that are more immediate, that should get a response, because they have immediate consequences that we can stop. And if we address those, they will work on reversing those climate repair, putting in place climate repair that will pull back on CO2, pull back on methane. We have to stop the boreal forests from burning, because as they spike, they are putting out much more CO2 and much more volatile compounds that, once they mix with the normal atmospheric process, we end up with tropospheric ozone, which is toxic to people. So John, we know we have these immediate demands that we need to address. And if we address those, we're addressing the forcings that can push us towards those tipping points.
John, you spoke there about this notion of climate repair, which is really this idea that there are steps that we can take to try to reverse some of what we've done so far. Now, obviously, that would require a huge amount of resources, but not only that, a huge amount of political will. And I want to talk a little bit about political will here. We're heading towards COP28, the 28th conference of the parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's nearly 3 decades of talking, and we're now living through the outcome of those 3 decades, well, nearly 3 decades of talks. That huge landmark Paris Agreement in 2015, a lot of people said that was only really possible because we saw a bilateral agreement between the two largest emitters in the world, China and the US, the year before. We know in the last few days that the special climate envoy from the US, John Kerry, has been in China having discussions there. Catherine, let me throw this one to you. What did you make of the tone of those discussions, especially as we head now towards another conference of the parties in Dubai?
Well, at least what we can see is that they want to set their other rifts, economic rifts, trade, collaboration rifts aside and focus on climate and get sort of their minds together and negotiate what they can both put to the table at the COP, and hopefully that yields an outcome. But what we all know, it's not about another negotiation. We all know that it's about action. The Paris Agreement is in force, and all countries that we talk about in the OECD space are lagging behind their targets. So I think it's about implementing their commitments and implementing or reaching their targets to net zero. So it's of course it's up to the two of them, but it's also a commitment that all countries are falling short of as we speak today.
Dorothy, I want to ask you a little bit more about the China dynamic there, because there is some hope that things might shift as we go forward. And obviously, China's also living through a huge heat wave in the north and experiencing extreme weather, flooding, and a huge amount of storms in the south. At the same time, though, China has doubled down on coal. And even these heat waves have actually, well, basically ended up using more coal because of air conditioning. And I know that the energy infrastructure in China is really designed to be dependent on coal. Now, at the same time, almost paradoxically, China has also been hugely scaling up renewables. And we know that renewables have become a lot cheaper, a lot more widespread around the world, but that's not necessarily been because of the reasons you've been pushing for, Dorothy, but because it makes more financial sense. So let me ask you then, does this give you hope that things might be changing, perhaps not for the reasons that you'd been pushing for, but that they are changing?
Well, it is good that key countries like the US and China are discussing, because they do need to cooperate and they do need to show climate leadership. But we have to understand as well that countries like the US, UK, countries in Europe are historic emitters. Although China is now a huge emitter, it is not a historic emitter. And it's good that you have also mentioned that compared to all the rest of the Western or Northern countries, China's use of renewable now far outstrip everyone else. It is using renewable more than all the other countries, and also because of its role in producing solar panels, the prices in the developing countries also reduce because of that role. So I think China play an important role. And one thing about China that we should also understand is that when it puts a plan, it plans long term, because I've been following China since 2005, actually. I have read in their medium-term development plan, this is our 5-year program, when they plan, they put 25 years or 10 years. And when they do that, they normally deliver, because there is a consistency in the government. Unlike in the US, although Biden now put the US back on climate leadership, but then he has a problem convincing the Congress to also follow his commitment. So there is that big difference. And also, many of the Western countries rely on business to do whatever they want to do. So in these cases, a just transition needs also a bit of planning from the government and also ownership of those crucial energy sectors, because you can't regulate anything that you don't own. So there needs to be a bigger role for governments in this kind of steps and measures. And I'm not surprised when John Kerry also mentioned that they will not pay compensation or reparations to the Global South. That has always been the U.S. line and U.S. position, which is actually not commensurate to their historic role. And unfortunately, that has always been their line. So with loss and damage, that happened in Egypt because of the unity of the Southern governments. For so long, the history of the COP is a history of backtracking, of delay, of denying for responsibility and obligations of the Northern countries. So I think it is time now that they deliver. It is time now that for big fossil fuel companies also to pay for those
huge questions of equity here.
Tax them, they can have finance obligation. Well,
I'm sorry, Dorothy, I do want to throw a last question here to John, because within the political landscape that we currently live in, and seeing what we're seeing now in terms of the extreme weather around the world, there has been increasing talk of geoengineering, this idea of trying to reduce some of the impacts of what we've done to our planet. So, for instance, flying planes up and shooting vapor into the sky to block out some of the sun, ideas like that. Now, for a long time, a lot of that was discussed almost as science fiction, but I see that both the White House and the EU are actually now taking it very seriously. They've made formal statements about it just over the last few weeks or so. John, what is your take on that? Do you think that it's a legitimate, interesting idea? Are there other questions of equity within that? Is this a last resort? Have we come to that?
It's an extraordinarily dangerous idea, only because, well, partly because we're experimenting with our home. And of course, we're already experimenting with our home by emitting so much CO2 when we know that it's bad for us. And there's actually quite a simple answer. We stop emitting CO2. It's yet another experiment if we go ahead with doing that, and it's very divisive in the atmospheric, well, not in the atmospheric sciences. They regard it to be a poor man's choice. It's an engineer's choice, and we've had engineers pumping CO2 into the atmosphere for a fair length of time, I think. It is another experiment, and yes, you could hypothesize that it might be a solution, but I don't know if I want to do that with my home. The other aspect to that is that people talk about this and it starts to get to look like greenwashing, and it can delay the obvious actions that we can put in place right now, as if to say we're going to buy ourselves more time. And to be honest, that's a fallacy. Even if we could put tens of thousands of aircraft into the air, lifting that much dust into the air to make a difference, that's a huge enterprise. We don't have that sort of infrastructure to lift that much into that layer of the atmosphere to make a difference.
And John, as you say,
have to choose which part of the globe to do it to.
Indeed. And as you say, we're already living through the impacts of our previous experiments on this planet. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there for today, but thank you to all of our guests, Catherine Gamper, John Nairn and Dorothy Guerrero. And thank you, too, for watching. Remember, you can watch this programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. For further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Remember, you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.